You don't belong here! Get out! Leave!
I am the guest of honor.
The first thing that hit the marble floor was his daughter's inhaler. The second was the tiny paper rose she had folded by hand all afternoon, its edges smeared with glitter because she wanted important people to remember it came from a child. The third was his dignity, when the security guard shoved the single dad backward and said, loud enough for half the ballroom to hear, "You don't belong here." If stories like this hit something deep inside you, subscribe, like the video, and stay with me until the end. Because what happened next didn't just silence a room full of rich people. It changed a little girl's life forever. Elias Ward didn't move for a second. Not because he wasn't angry, because his daughter Sophie was on her knees in that polished hotel entrance, searching for her inhaler under a stranger's shoe, while laughter rolled across the marble like thrown glass. "She can't breathe," Elias said. It came out low, controlled, too controlled. The security guard barely looked at him. "Then take her outside." A woman in diamonds covered her mouth as if the scene itself smelled bad. A man holding a champagne flute muttered, "How do people like this even get in?" People like this. Sophie finally found the inhaler, but her little hands were shaking so badly she dropped it again. Elias was on the floor in an instant. "I've got it, baby. Look at me. Slow breath. Good girl. Slow." She clung to his wrist, fighting for air. Eyes wet and wide and humiliated in a way no 8-year-old should ever understand. And that was the moment Elias almost walked away. Not because he was weak, because he had spent the last 4 years walking away from rooms like this to protect what little dignity he and Sophie still had left. But tonight wasn't supposed to be like every other night. Tonight, an embossed black invitation had arrived at their apartment with his name on it. Mr. Elias Ward. Requested at the annual Harlow Foundation Winter Gala. Guest to be seated in the main hall. He had checked the envelope 3 times. Then he checked the building address. Then he laughed, because there had to be some mistake. Sophie hadn't laughed. She had stared at that invitation like it was a door God forgot to lock. "Maybe this is the thing," she whispered. Elias looked up from helping her steady her breathing. "What thing?" "The good thing," she said. "The one after all the bad ones." Now her paper rose was crushed near the heel of a woman who had probably spent more on earrings than Elias spent on rent in 4 months. He reached for it. The woman stepped back like his fingers might stain her. That's when a familiar voice cut through the crowd. "Well," it said smoothly, "if it isn't Elias Ward." Elias froze before he even turned. Julian Mercer stood at the top of the entrance steps in a black tuxedo that fit him like arrogance had tailored it personally. He was smiling. That was the worst part. Not the expensive watch, not the polished shoes, not even the little circle of powerful people around him, all half-turned to see the drama. The smile. Because Elias knew that smile. It was the same one Julian wore the night 4 years ago when the flames climbed the walls, alarms screamed, and Julian said, "Do what I tell you, and your family keeps their insurance." Julian's gaze dropped to Sophie, then back to Elias. "You really brought your child?" Elias stood slowly, one hand on Sophie's shoulder. "I was invited." A few guests exchanged glances. Julian gave a soft, amused breath through his nose. "Invited," he repeated, like the word itself was entertainment. Elias pulled the envelope from his inner jacket pocket and handed it over. Julian looked at the seal. For the first time, something flickered behind his eyes. Then it disappeared. He handed the invitation to the guard without even opening it. "This was sent in error." "It has my name on it." "Yes," Julian said. "And somehow that makes this even more embarrassing." Sophie looked up at her father. "Dad." "It's okay," Elias said. But it wasn't. Not even close. Julian took a step down, lowering his voice just enough to make it crueler. "You should have called before showing up. I could have spared you this." "You didn't spare me last time." That landed. The smile on Julian's face tightened, but only for a second. Then he leaned closer. "You still don't understand the difference between a warning and mercy." Sophie's hand slipped into her father's. Julian noticed. His gaze went to the paper rose in Elias's other hand, bent and glittering and pathetic against all the black silk and crystal around them. "What is that?" Sophie swallowed. "It was for Ms. Harlow." A few people actually laughed at that. Not loud. Worse. Soft enough to pretend they weren't cruel. Julian's expression turned almost pitying. Victoria Harlow is about to host senators, investors, and the board of the largest charitable foundation in the state. She is not waiting for arts and crafts from strangers. Elias felt Sophie's grip tighten until her fingers hurt. And that was the first crack in him. Because he could handle being mocked. He had done it before. He had worked construction sites where men half his age called him professor because he used to run emergency systems for a billion-dollar company. He had smiled through landlords talking slowly to him, like poverty was a hearing problem. He had sold his wedding ring to pay for a specialist, while pretending to Sophie that he'd just stopped wearing jewelry. But hearing rich adults laugh at a child's handmade gift? That was different. He bent, picked up the crushed paper rose, and smoothed it as best he could. Then he looked up at Julian with the kind of silence that made lesser men step back. Julian didn't. Instead, he raised his chin toward security. "Remove them." The guard reached for Elias's arm. Bad choice. Elias caught the wrist instantly. Not hard, just fast. Fast enough to make the man blink. Fast enough to remind Julian that some things didn't disappear just because a man got poorer. Elias released the guard a second later and said, very quietly, "Don't put your hands on me again." The room changed. Not much, just enough. The laughter stopped. People started paying real attention. Julian's eyes narrowed. "Threatening security in front of my guests is not helping your case." "Your guests?" Elias said. Julian smiled again. "Tonight, yes." And there it was, the second crack. Because this gala was being held in the Harlow Grand Atrium, a place Elias knew down to the hidden maintenance access behind the velvet walls and the old sprinkler control line near the west stairwell. 4 years ago, when a kitchen fire turned into an inferno because someone had ignored 3 failed safety inspections, Elias was the one who ran into smoke while everyone else ran for exits. 4 years ago, Julian had been screaming orders into a dead radio, while Elias carried child after child through heat so violent it peeled paint. 4 years ago, Julian had become a hero in the newspapers, and Elias had disappeared. "Come on, Dad," Sophie whispered. "Please." Not because she wanted to stay, because she knew that tone in his chest. The one that meant old pain was waking up. Elias looked at her, and the anger inside him changed shape. It became shame. Again. Always shame. "Okay," he said. "We're leaving." Julian relaxed too quickly. "Wise." Then a voice came from behind the crowd. "No," it said. "He isn't." The guests parted. An older woman in a midnight blue uniform stepped through them, carrying a silver tray she had clearly forgotten she was holding. Rosa, housekeeping supervisor. Same kind eyes, same limp. Same woman who had once cried into Elias's soot-covered shoulder because he had pulled her grandson out of the smoke. Julian stiffened. "This area is closed to staff." Rosa ignored him completely. She walked straight to Elias and Sophie, looked at the crumpled rose in his hand, and her face changed. Not pity. Recognition. She looked up at Elias like she had been waiting years to do exactly that. "Mr. Ward," she said, voice trembling. "Miss Harlow has been asking for you for the last 30 minutes. Silence. A heavy, strange, electric silence. Julian recovered first. "There's a misunderstanding." Rosa turned to him. "No, sir, there isn't." Then she faced Elias again. "She said the moment you arrived, you were to be brought through the west corridor." Sophie blinked. "You know my dad?" Rosa's eyes filled. "Your father saved my family." Julian stepped forward. "Rosa, that's enough." "No," she said, and this time steel came out. What was enough was 4 years of lies. Now the room wasn't just watching, it was listening. Julian's jaw flexed. "You're out of line." Rosa set the tray down on a side table with shaking hands. "He carried children through fire while you stood outside giving interviews." Elias closed his eyes for half a second. He hated this. Not the truth, the publicness of it. Because truth, once spoken aloud, demanded more truth. And there was still a little girl beside him who didn't know everything. Julian looked around at the guests, smiled like this was all an unfortunate emotional episode, and said, "Mr. Ward was a facilities employee involved in an incident years ago. I'm sure trauma has distorted a few memories." "Don't," Elias said. Julian's voice dropped. "Then leave." That old tone again. The one from the night of the fire. The night Clara was waiting at St. Mary's Hospital for test results that would tell them whether the latest treatment had worked. The night Elias answered Julian's frantic call because he was still on emergency contract. The night he should have ignored it. The night he heard children screaming behind a jammed service door. The night he ran in. The night Clara died before he reached the hospital. Not because of the fire. Because cancer didn't wait for a husband trying to be a hero in someone else's disaster. And Julian knew exactly where to press. "You have a daughter," Julian murmured. "Think carefully before you decide what kind of night this becomes." Sophie looked between them. "Dad, what does he mean?" Elias didn't answer. He couldn't. Because buried under the rage, under the humiliation, under the years of swallowed words, there was one ugly fact Julian had always owned. Elias had signed the silence agreement. He had let them bury the truth. Because Julian promised Clara's treatment would stay covered under Harlow Executive Emergency Benefits if Elias took the blame for neglected inspections and kept his mouth shut. By the time Elias learned Julian had cut the coverage anyway, Clara was gone. And by then, nobody wanted the truth. A disgraced maintenance chief made a cleaner story than a cowardly executive who locked an exit to hide unpaid contractors in a restricted wing. Rosa reached for Elias's sleeve. "Please, Ms. Harlow needs to see you." He looked at Sophie. Her eyes were huge. Not scared of the room, scared of him. Scared that he might choose silence again. So Elias bent down to her level. His voice was rough. You asked me once why I don't like fancy buildings. Sophie nodded. I'm going to tell you everything, but not here. Are we in trouble? He held her face gently. Not if I stop running. That hit something inside her. You could see it. Children always know more than adults think. They know when a parent is speaking to them and when a parent is confessing to himself. Sophie took a breath through the inhaler and gave one tiny nod. All right, she whispered. Rosa led them through a side corridor lined with mirrored walls and gold sconces, away from the music and the silk and the stink of polished cruelty. But Julian followed. Of course he did. His shoes clicked behind them with controlled urgency. Elias, he said. Last chance. Rosa kept walking. Elias didn't turn. Julian's voice sharpened. Do you really think Victoria Harlow wants a martyr? She wants a symbol, a neat one. The second you make this ugly, she will protect the company first. People like us always learn that too late. Elias stopped. Not because he was convinced, because that part was believable. Victoria Harlow was a legend in the city. Ruthless, brilliant, surgical with power. She built hospitals, bought newspapers, funded scholarships, crushed competitors. Women like that weren't supposed to apologize. They were supposed to survive. Dad? Sophie said softly. Julian saw the hesitation and went for the throat. You tell this story your way tonight, and by morning, your daughter gets to watch the internet turn you into a liar, a bitter ex-employee, maybe even a danger to public safety. I have enough paper to bury you twice. Elias turned then. Slowly. He looked tired more than angry, which somehow made it worse. You used my wife, he said. Julian's face barely changed. I gave you a choice. You threatened her treatment. I protected what matters. Elias stepped closer. Rosa sucked in a breath. Sophie went still. Julian lowered his voice. Do not lose your temper in front of your child. And Elias smiled. It was small, broken, and frightening. You still think my temper is the thing that should scare you? Before Julian could answer, another voice came from the end of the corridor. Mercer. All three of them turned. Victoria Harlow stood beneath the chandelier spill from the private hall entrance, silver-haired, razor-straight, wrapped in a black gown so severe it looked almost military. She wasn't alone. 2 board members stood behind her. So did a woman holding a tablet. And in that instant, Julian's confidence finally slipped. Not much, just enough for Elias to see it. Victoria's eyes went first to Sophie, then to the crushed rose in Elias's hand, then to the faint red mark on his sleeve where security had grabbed him. Her expression hardened by degrees. Mr. Ward, she said, you came. Elias gave a short, humorless laugh. Apparently against some resistance. Victoria looked at Julian. I can see that. Julian straightened. There's been confusion at the door. I was handling it. Victoria stepped closer, still staring at Elias. No, you were preventing it. No one spoke. Even the music from the ballroom felt far away now. She turned to Sophie and, to everyone's surprise, lowered herself slightly so they were eye level. "Are you Sophie?" Sophie nodded. Victoria noticed the inhaler, the trembling fingers, the ruined paper rose. Something old and private passed through her face. "My assistant should have escorted you the moment you arrived," she said. "That failure is mine." Sophie looked at Elias before answering. "This was for you." She held out the wrinkled rose. Victoria took it with both hands. No hesitation, no performance. And that was the first moment Elias believed this night might not go the way Julian promised. "It's beautiful," Victoria said. Sophie whispered, "He told me important people forget little things." Victoria glanced at Elias. "Your father saved lives because he did not forget little things." Julian cut in quickly. "Victoria, perhaps this is a conversation for later. The room is waiting." "Yes," she said. "For him." Julian's face went blank. Victoria turned to Elias. "There are still details I wish had reached me years ago instead of tonight. But the board has seen enough." The woman with the tablet stepped forward and held it where Julian could see. Elias caught only fragments. Inspection logs, security override, exit chain authorization, Julian's login. Julian took a step back. "You're doing this now?" Victoria's voice became ice. "I am doing this because you made a child watch her father be humiliated on the same floor where you built your reputation on his courage." Sophie looked up at Elias. "What does that mean?" He swallowed. This was it. No more postponing hard truths until she was older. No more wrapping pain in quieter words. He knelt in the corridor, tuxedos and board members, and one of the most feared CEOs in the country forgotten around him. "4 years ago," he said, "there was a fire here." Sophie's face changed. She knew that part. There had always been a fire in the story, just never the whole one. "I came because Mr. Mercer said people were trapped. He told me the emergency systems were failing. When I got here," Elias exhaled, "they weren't failing. Someone had shut an exit and ignored the warnings that the wiring in the catering wing was dangerous." Sophie's mouth parted. "You went in?" "Yes." "Why?" He stared at her, and his voice broke on the word. "Because there were kids inside." A long silence. Then the question he had been dreading for 4 years. "What about Mom?" The corridor disappeared. He was back in the parking lot under red strobes and frozen air, looking at 14 missed calls on a cracked phone. He was back hearing Clara's final voicemail in an ambulance bay after it was too late. He was back folding in half beside the curb because there are griefs so physical they feel like being struck. "Mom was waiting for me at the hospital," he said. "I thought I could do both, save them and get to her. I thought there was still time." Sophie's eyes filled instantly, but she didn't look away. "And there wasn't?" "No." That one word nearly ended him. She threw her arms around his neck so hard he lost balance and dropped to both knees. "I'm sorry," she whispered into his shoulder. "I'm sorry you were alone." Elias shut his eyes. There it was. The heartbreak he never knew he had been waiting for. Not her pity, her understanding. For years he had carried the guilt in silence because he was the adult,
Because fathers are supposed to become walls when everything else collapses. Because if he spoke the truth out loud, maybe it would finally crush them both. Instead, his little girl held him like she knew he had been drowning standing up. Victoria turned away discreetly. Even Rosa wiped her eyes. Julian didn't. He looked furious. Cornered people always do. "This is sentiment," he snapped, "not law." Victoria faced him. "Then let's try facts. You authorized the lock override on the West Service exit. You dismissed 2 fire code complaints. You altered the incident report.
And you personally negotiated a liability agreement with a man whose wife was dying. Julian's voice rose. He signed it. Because you weaponized desperation, Victoria said. He looked at Elias. And now what? You want applause? Money? A better suit? Elias stood slowly, Sophie still holding his hand. For the first time all night, he didn't look like a man trying to survive the room. He looked like a man finally done fearing it. No, he said. I want my daughter to grow up knowing I was a coward once, and that I decided not to die that way. That landed harder than a scream. Victoria straightened. Escort Mr. Mercer to the legal conference room. He is relieved of all duties effective immediately. One of the board members stepped aside as 2 internal security officers appeared at the corridor entrance. Julian laughed once, disbelieving. You're destroying a decade of company growth over a facilities worker. Victoria's answer was quiet. No. Over a man who ran into fire while my executives ran toward cameras. Julian looked at Elias one last time, and the hatred in his face was almost relieved. Because monsters prefer clear endings. He had believed, right up until the last moment, that Elias would stay small. When they led him away, Sophie squeezed her father's hand. Is it over? Elias looked toward the ballroom doors. Crystal light spilled beneath them. Music swelled. Hundreds of voices beyond that wall had no idea the night was about to split open. He exhaled. No, baby. It's starting. Victoria held out her arm toward the main entrance to the hall. Walk with me. Elias hesitated. He looked down at his suit, the worn cuffs, the cheap shoes polished 3 times in their kitchen light, the place where the thread had come loose near his sleeve. Victoria followed his gaze. Mr. Ward, she said, if anyone in that room deserves to enter exactly as he is, it is you. The ballroom doors opened. Conversation rolled through the hall in warm, golden waves. A string quartet played beneath chandeliers that probably cost more than Elias's first house would have, back when he still believed he would have one. Every head turned. Some recognized him from the door. Some recognized the girl. Some saw Victoria Harlow walking beside them and knew instantly they had judged the wrong man. At the center of the stage stood a giant screen displaying a single line in white letters. Courage is what remains when there is nothing left to gain. The room went quiet as Victoria stepped to the microphone. She did not smile. Good evening, she said. Tonight was intended to honor leadership. But leadership without integrity is costume jewelry. Bright, expensive, worthless. A ripple moved through the room. She continued. 4 years ago, during a catastrophic fire in this very building, multiple children and staff were trapped in a restricted wing. The public was given one story. Tonight, that story ends. The screen changed. Photos. Smoke. Ambulances. News headlines. Then surveillance stills. A man carrying a child through blackened hallway heat. Another trip back in. Another. And another. Even blurred by smoke, Elias recognized himself. He heard gasps. He heard chairs shift. He heard one woman near the front whisper, "Oh my God." Victoria turned toward him. "Our guest of honor is not a senator, not a donor, not a man who bought his way onto a magazine cover. He is a father who gave up his career, his name, and nearly his future to save families he did not know." Sophie looked up at him like she was seeing him and learning him at the same time. Victoria's voice softened. "Elias Ward, please join me on stage." For one insane second, he couldn't move. This was the same ballroom whose entrance had spit him out minutes ago. The same room where laughter followed his daughter's humiliation. The same place where Julian's lie had lived comfortably among chandeliers and crystal. Now there was no laughter, only silence. Heavy. Expectant. Elias took Sophie's hand and walked. Not fast, not dramatic, just steady. The kind of steady men earn after surviving things no one clapped for. Every eye tracked him as he stepped onto the stage. He heard sniffles from somewhere near the left aisle. He saw Rosa standing near the back with both hands over her mouth. He saw people who had laughed at the door avoiding his gaze. Good. Let them. Victoria handed him the microphone. He stared at it, then at the room. He hadn't planned a speech. Men like him never do. They plan rent, school pickups, medicine refills, how to make canned soup feel like dinner on a Thursday. But Sophie's hand was still in his. So he spoke. "I didn't come here for this," he said. His voice echoed softly through the ballroom. "I came because my daughter believed an invitation addressed to me might mean life was finally done punishing us." A strained laugh broke somewhere, then silence again. "I almost left at the door. Maybe I should thank the people who made that decision hard for me." He let that sit. "But the truth is, leaving has been my specialty." He looked down for a moment, then back up. "When my wife got sick, I told myself I could hold everything together. Work, treatment, fatherhood, hope. The night of the fire, I thought I could save strangers and still make it back to her in time." His voice caught. He didn't hide it. "I was wrong." You could feel the room lean toward him. Not physically, emotionally. The way people do when someone stops performing and starts bleeding truth. "I blamed myself for years," Elias said. "Not for saving those kids, for surviving what came after. Because once the headlines fade, people like me don't get heroic endings. We get bills. We get silence. We get told to be grateful for whatever scraps are left." He looked at Sophie. She was crying openly now, but smiling through it. "But my daughter," he swallowed hard. "My daughter is the reason I'm standing here. Because tonight, she watched grown adults try to make us feel small, and instead of teaching her to leave quietly, I had to decide what kind of man she would remember." Nobody moved. Nobody reached for a glass. Nobody whispered. "I want something simple," he said. "I want every father raising a child alone, every mother working 3 jobs, every family told they don't fit the room, to know this. Being humiliated is not the same as being unworthy." Now people were crying. Actual crying. Not polite, damp-eyed sympathy. The ugly kind. The honest kind. Elias drew one shaky breath and finished. "And if you ever have to choose between looking respectable and telling the truth, choose the truth. Respect built on lies burns faster than paper. He handed the microphone back. The applause started slowly, not because the room was hesitant, because some moments are too human for immediate noise. Then it rose, and rose, and rose. Not the light social applause rich people use to congratulate each other for existing. This was thunder. People stood. One row, then another, then the entire ballroom. A standing ovation for the man they had nearly thrown onto the street. Sophie buried her face into Elias's side, overwhelmed. He bent and kissed the top of her head. Victoria returned to the microphone only when the room finally settled. In recognition of extraordinary courage, she said, the Harlow Foundation is awarding Elias Ward the Medal of Civil Valor, restoring his full professional record and establishing the Clara Ward Family Safety Scholarship in his wife's name. Elias looked up so sharply it hurt his neck. Victoria met his eyes. "There is more," she said. "Mr. Ward, if you choose to accept, I would also like you to serve as Director of Community Safety Oversight for every Harlow property in the state, effective immediately." The room erupted again. Elias just stared. He actually laughed once, short and stunned. Sophie yanked his sleeve. "Dad! Dad!" He crouched to her level. "What?" She was crying so hard words came out in pieces. "Mom! Mom would have said yes before you could even finish pretending to think about it." For the first time that night, Elias laughed with his whole face. And because grief is strange and love is stranger, that laugh nearly made him cry harder than anything else had. Victoria stepped closer and spoke quietly so only they could hear. "There's one more thing." Nick nodded to her assistant, who brought over a small envelope. Inside was a restored audio chip in a protective sleeve. Elias knew what it was before she said it. "We recovered it from your personnel effects archive," Victoria said. "Your wife's voicemail. The original file. Cleaned." His hand started shaking instantly. He had kept the broken version for years on an old phone that crackled and cut and hurt too much to play. Sophie saw his face. "What is it?" He couldn't answer. Victoria did. "It's your mother's voice." Sophie covered her mouth. "Can we?" she whispered. Elias nodded, unable to trust himself. The assistant handed them a small device and earpiece splitter. Father and daughter stood together at the side of the stage while the ballroom respectfully turned away. He pressed play. Static. Then Clara. Warm, tired, smiling through pain the way she always did. "Hey, love. If you're hearing this late, it means you stopped for someone again." Elias shut his eyes. Sophie let out a sound that broke him open. Clara's voice continued, soft and certain. "Don't you dare apologize for being who you are. If our little girl asks who her father is, tell her he runs toward people when everyone else runs away. Then tell her I loved him for that. I always will." By the end, both of them were crying too hard to stand straight. Sophie clung to him, whispering, "That's Mom. That's Mom." "Yes," he said, tears falling freely now. "That's Mom." Out in the ballroom, the applause began again. Gentler this time. Not for a hero. For a family that had just been handed something money could never buy back, but almost had. Later, when the speeches ended and the donors lined up to shake his hand and the people who had laughed at the door suddenly discovered shame, Elias didn't make a scene.
He didn't embarrass them. He didn't need to. Nothing humiliates cruelty like surviving it in public. On the way out, the same security guard who shoved him at the entrance stood near the doors, pale and rigid. Elias paused in front of him. The man swallowed. "Sir, I'm sorry." Elias looked at Sophie.
She was holding the metal case in one hand, and the paper rose Victoria had carefully straightened in the other. Then he looked back at the guard. "Next time," he said, "when a scared little girl says she can't breathe, believe her before you believe a tuxedo." He walked past him without waiting for an answer. Outside, snow had started falling over the city. Soft, clean, quiet enough to make the night feel unreal. Sophie tucked herself against his side as they stood at the top of the hotel steps. "Dad?" "Yeah?" "Are we still people like this?" He looked down at her, at the metal, at the rose, at the building behind them, glowing gold against the dark, no longer a monument to what they had lost. "No," he said softly. "We never were." She smiled through the last of her tears. "Good." Then she slipped her small hand into his and asked the question only children know how to ask at exactly the right moment. "So, what happens next?" Elias looked up at the falling snow. For the first time in years, the answer didn't frighten him. "Something better," he said. And as father and daughter walked down those steps together, leaving behind the room that once tried to shame them, every person watching understood the same thing at once. The poor man at the door had never needed their permission to matter. He only needed the truth to finally walk in beside him. Tell me in the comments, if you had been in Elias's place, would you have stayed silent? Or would you have told the truth, no matter what it cost?